When I asked what time the engagement dinner was, I was rinsing coffee cups I'd set out just in case someone stopped by when my phone lit up with a cheerful photo of my daughter's hand nails pale pink, a ring shining like a tiny sun. My thumb hovered over the screen, smiling before I could help it, and I typed the most ordinary question a mother can ask: "What time is the engagement dinner?" Her reply arrived with the bright cruelty of noon. "We had it yesterday." For a moment, the kitchen dimmed as if a cloud had crossed the light. I set the dish towel down and listened to a house that knew my breath better than anyone. It made that old settling sound in the walls, the same one it made when my husband would turn in his sleep. My name is Margaret, though everyone who ever needed anything from me called me Mom. I am 58, a hospital unit clerk, a widow who still forgets and says we when I mean I. The counters are the ones we saved for the ones he swore would last longer than our knees. I pressed my palm to the cool quartz and let the sting rise and pass like a wave. Then I opened the cabinet above the stove where the envelopes wait like quiet threats, and I began to read. The first statement was a mistake until it wasn't a florist. I didn't hire a deposit at a venue I had never heard of, a catering company whose logo with copper forks looked expensive on purpose. I blinked at numbers that didn't belong to me and touched the paper to feel if it was real. It was. $17,000, real. I had added my daughter to my card years ago, for emergencies, that slippery word that can stretch until it becomes a net you never climb out of. Weddings are emergencies to the young, I suppose, crises of aesthetics, where a missing arrangement feels like disaster, where love has a budget, as if vows could be bought in centerpieces. I had taught my children to call when a tire blew out or a fever in the night scared them. I had not taught them, apparently, that a mother is not a bottomless well. The second envelope cut me differently, a bill for a suit rented by my son for a family event, as if I were a neighbor invited after the photographs. I sat down. The chair creaked like a confession. I remembered the look on my husband's face when we paid off this house, that sideways grin he used when joy embarrassed him. And I felt a grief I didn't recognize, not for him, though that is a permanent river, but for the version of me who believed love could not be used against her. It is strange the way a life tilts. You think the disaster is the death, the diagnosis, the job gone the night you sleep on the floor of a hospice room and wake to silence. You think what comes next will be a straight line of getting by. You don't plan for a quiet betrayal inked in numbers for grown children who speak to you in tones you once used for utility companies. For the moment, you see yourself in their eyes as something useful and not beloved. This is how a heart breaks in a kitchen. Not with shouting, not with thrown plates, but with the sudden realization that those you love have grown accustomed to you, the way people grow accustomed to a lamp, always there, always illuminating, never considered until it flickers. I had been flickering for years and calling it kindness. I wish I could tell you, I marched across town and made a scene under chandeliers, but the truth is softer and maybe truer. I folded the statements, slid them back into their envelopes, and placed them in the drawer with my tea bags and rubber bands. Then I boiled water and steeped chamomile like a woman determined to remain gentle while deciding to change everything. When the kettle clicked off, I wrote a list in my husband's old spiral notebook. It felt ceremonial, the way I used to feel the first day of school, except the lesson now was mine. Call the bank. Freeze the cards. Remove my son from my savings account. Ask the attorney at the clinic for a referral to someone who does wills. Find the deed. Take the spare keys off the hook by the door. Schedule a lock change. Text my daughter that I love her and I need to talk in person. I kept writing until the pen ran dry, and I took that as a sign that I was allowed to begin again. It would be tidier if the story had a single villain, an easy cutout shape where all the blame fits. But I was there too, in every yes that cost me a piece of myself. I was there in the way I didn't correct their tone, in the way I preferred peace to self-respect, in the way I said, "I'm fine," when I was in fact a woman eating toast over the sink after a 12-hour shift because I didn't want anyone to hear me chew. When a mother fails to teach the word enough, the world teaches her the word never. My grief had made me sweet. My sweetness had made me invisible. My invisibility had made me convenient. And convenience, as anyone who has ever been the family organizer knows, is the most addictive drug. They were addicted to me, and I was the dealer who hated the product and still kept handing it over. The hours between noticing and acting were merciless. I worked at the hospital that evening and found myself staring too long at other people's hands. A man with a sprained wrist held his girlfriend's fingers as if they were the only convincing argument for staying alive. A nurse tapped her ring against a medication cart while counting pills and smiled at a text that made her mouth soften. I washed my hands a dozen times and watched water run away as if it knew where to go. On my break, I sat in the staff lounge with the vending machine hum and a half-finished crossword, and the new knowledge that my daughter had toasted her future without me. I pictured a long table of glowing people, the clink of glasses, someone's laughter as bright as the ring. I imagined they thought they were protecting me from the noise of celebration while planning to send me the bill. I imagined they would have included me when the photographs were edited into a montage for the wedding, and I would have smiled through the ache and said, "It's lovely, darling." And in that moment, something inside me decided not to exist like that anymore. The next morning, I called the bank. The woman on the phone had the kind of voice you wish you could borrow for your own life, calm, precise, unimpressed by panic. We went through the charges one by one, the syllables of expensive names falling into a kind of litany. She asked questions like a careful doctor. I answered like a patient finally telling the truth. When she said we can put a hold on the account immediately, I felt my lungs expand all the way to the bottom. It is odd how power returns not as lightning, but as breath. Then I called a locksmith, then an attorney, then the clinic where I once sat with my husband, and a stack of forms that listed his entire life in boxes you could tick. I made coffee I did not drink. I opened windows I had kept closed because his old sweater still smelled faintly of cedar. The house aired out like a chest exhaling. My son texted at noon to say his card wasn't working, and he'd call me when he wasn't slammed. The old version of me would have apologized before he even dialed. I put my phone face down on the table and fed the cat. My daughter sent a heart emoji and then a script of practicality's final deposit due by Friday photographer expecting retainer. Could I just float her for another week? I typed a sentence I had practiced all morning. I love you. I will not be paying for your wedding. Then I erased it and typed something truer for me. I love you. I've changed the way I will be loving you. I turned the phone face down again and wondered how many years I had let myself be spoken to, as if my only language was giving. If you have ever had to choose yourself in a family that benefits from your not doing so, you know the theater that follows. There is the opening act of shock, the mid-show soliloquy about ungratefulness and how I have always been there, an unanswerable argument because its premise is true and the truth has been used as a weapon. There is the intermission where nobody calls, which is both punishment and relief. There is the second act, which is a parade of comparisons, other mothers, other sacrifices, the myth that motherhood is holiness, measured in receipts. And there is the finale, which is quiet you in your own kitchen, tasting the simple flavor of a boundary, and realizing it is not bitterness at all, but a salt you should have added long ago. That afternoon, I drove to the courthouse with the deed in a folder and sat on a bench under a fan that made the whole hallway whir like a tired bird. Office workers slid past in shoes that made polite noises. When it was my turn, I said my husband's name out loud and did not shatter. The clerk stamped things that did not need stamping because sometimes a person understands you need the sound of a seal more than the legal effect of it. She looked me in the eyes and said, "You're doing the right thing," in a voice that didn't sound like a stranger's. I walked back into the heat with papers that looked exactly the same as when I had entered, and felt like a woman who had finally been issued herself. I want to tell you about a moment I did not expect. The neighbor who waved me over that evening while I watered the hydrangeas, the way she didn't ask for the story, but somehow made space for it, the way we stood in the soft drag of the hose across the lawn and laughed at nothing for 3 minutes, the way she said, "I made too much soup," and I said I have too much bread, and we carried both into my kitchen and rearranged the table to make room for a future that had more chairs than I thought. Revenge is such a sharp word for what I felt. It wasn't that. It wasn't even justice, though I won't pretend the thought of canceling a venue that did not belong to my life felt anything less than delicious. It was reclamation. It was the first time since the hospice room that I looked at myself and thought, you are not the sum of their needs. Later, when the house settled into its evening creaks, and the last neighbor's television threw a square of blue against their curtains, I sat with a notebook and wrote down what I had lost and what I had found. Lost the illusion that love means never refusing, the habit of apologizing for the sound of my own key in my own door, the version of my children I kept in my head forever, 12 and forever kind. Found the ground under my feet, a voice that can say no without trembling, the kind of loneliness that is actually space, the memory of what my husband admired in me before either of us knew what sickness could take. I wrote until the page refused more ink. Then I put the notebook away and let myself imagine a wedding where the only vows I make are to the woman who lives in this house now. The morning after the courthouse, I cleaned in the way people clean when they are remapping their lives. I pulled everything from the junk drawer and sat cross-legged on the kitchen floor, sorting batteries that had betrayed their own memory. Rubber bands that had grown brittle with patience, takeout menus from restaurants that had quietly died and been replaced by newer places with shorter names. I found the spare key to my daughter's old apartment in a tiny envelope labeled "Just in case" in my husband's handwriting, and I pressed my thumb over the words until the ink warmed under my skin. I kept the envelope and threw the key away. Not in anger, more like the way you remove a splinter that you once convinced yourself was part of you. When the floorboards began to complain and my knees joined the chorus, I stood up, made tea, and texted my daughter again. I love you. I need to see you today. She typed back, can we do coffee? I chose a cafe halfway between us, a place with plants that have outlived a dozen baristas and a glass case that makes pastries look like artifacts. I was early. I am always early when my heart is heavy, as if time itself might be a thing I can control if I get a head start. I ordered water and held it with both hands like I was learning how to drink. My daughter arrived a whirl of light. She has always been light, even when it sears me. And she kissed my cheek in the distracted way busy people show love, as if affection were a checkbox you tick while scanning an email. The ring flickered, a small sun rehearsing for the main event. I wanted to say you didn't need it to be this big. I wanted to say the size of the stone cannot steady your life. I wanted to say I bought mine with a paycheck and your father's shy smile, and it is in the drawer now because grief teaches you the weight of metal too. Instead, I said you look beautiful because it was true, and because truth still feels like the only thing I can afford. We made small talk that was not small at all, if you count what was racing underneath it: final fittings, the way her fiancé says root instead of root. The florist who only takes Zell, can you believe it? I nodded at the correct moments and watched my daughter try to be a person who isn't asking for anything, while also asking for everything. When the server took our plates, I placed the folded statements on the table like a placemat for the next words. Her face stiffened the way faces do when they are deciding which version of themselves to be. "Mom," she said, and already I heard the courtroom lighting click on. "I was going to tell you." "I believe you," I said. And I did, in the sense that I believe she lives in a world where telling me the truth later has felt safer than telling me now. "I need you to hear me. I love you. I am not paying for your wedding." She blinked once and went very still. "I have given birth. I know what stillness means. It is the breath before the next wave." She exhaled arguments that had likely been rehearsed with someone else. "This is normal. Everyone's parents contribute. You said you wished Grandma and Grandpa had been around to help us the way they helped you. You know I'm careful." I nodded at each sentence like I was meeting guests at a door, letting them pass without inviting them to stay. "I may have said yes to things that looked like love and sounded like love," I said, feeling my voice steady itself on a stone. I hadn't known was under the water, but none of those things required me to disappear. She burst into tears. Other diners turned their heads and then dutifully looked down, as if we were a play they had not bought tickets to watch. I offered a napkin and did not reach for my wallet to buy peace with sugar. She said I was making this about me the oldest and laziest insult in any family where the mother has not yet thrown a chair. I thought of all the years I had made it not about me and how unhappy that had made everyone, how entitlement grows best in soil enriched by quiet sacrifice. I've made some changes, I told her. The card is frozen. The deed is secured. I met with an attorney. I will help you with something small that feels like a gift. I won't fund a fantasy you think will pass for security. She dabbed at her eyes, looking exquisite in grief, the way she always has a talent that frightens me, because it means she understands how beauty can be used. He said this would happen, she said. He said widows hoard. The word hit me like a door banging shut from somewhere deep in the house. He, her fiancé. I pictured a kitchen. I do not know a man I have only met twice, leaning back in a chair and naming me with a shrug. I wanted to say, tell him widows have learned the price of each breath. I wanted to say, tell him girls are not banks. I wanted to say, come home and let me feed you soup until the part of you that believes love is expensive remembers that it is also cheap and human and hungry and cannot be held in photographs. Instead, I said I will not be spoken about like that in my own family, and felt the sentence lift me like a bridge I could finally cross. She asked if I would at least meet them both for dinner so we can clear the air. The phrase made me smile because people who say that do not intend to breathe anything but their own certainty. Still, I agreed. It was Sunday. We would meet Wednesday. I drove home with the radio off and listened to the car hum like a machine tolerant of my indecision. At a red light, I caught my reflection in the rear view, that particular astonishment we feel when the face we carry finally matches the life we have decided to live. I did not look cruel. I looked like a woman who would drive herself to a lake and stay until the water admitted her name. That night, I opened the chest in my closet where I keep the untouchables, his letters. The hospital ID bands the receipt for the cheapest red wine we ever loved. Under those, wrapped in a scarf that smells faintly of rain, is the envelope with the cabin paperwork. Our ridiculous word for a small house on a modest lake with porch screens that do not keep every mosquito out, and a dock that tilts like a drunk uncle. My husband signed it over to me the year before he died, as if he had reached into the future and laid a hand on my shoulder. When his handwriting meets mine on the page, I feel a tether that doesn't break. The cabin suddenly felt like a place to rehearse the woman I would be on Wednesday. I threw a bag together, 2 shirts, a paperback that embarrasses me, the ugliest cardigan I own, because it does not ask me to perform, and I drove in the late light when the town thins and the road remembers who paved it. The cabin greeted me with the smell of pine and the sound of geese counseling each other across the water. I opened windows, swept, made a bed smooth as a verdict, and then sat on the porch until the sky invented itself into evening. There is a quiet that arrives only after a person has chosen. It is not peace, it is instruction. It tells you to eat an apple slowly. It tells you to write the letter you will not send. It tells you to rehearse not the speech, but the silence you will keep when someone tries to twist your words into tools. I practiced answering the questions I feared most with sentences that honored me. Are you really going to embarrass your children? I won't be an accomplice to my own erasure. Don't you want to be part of their joy? I want joy that does not cost me myself. What would your husband think? He would hand me the keys to this place and tell me to sleep. I woke at 4 to rain loud enough to count. In the dim kitchen, I made coffee in the old percolator that spits anger before it purrs, and I wrote a list of practicalities for Wednesday. It looked like nothing and felt like scaffolding 3 numbers for payments I had already canceled. The bank's fraud department contact card, phrases I could set on the table like coasters to catch the rings of their rebuttals. The first time my pen lifted, I chose to add something that had not been there the day before: consequences. It is a word nobody loves until they have met their own. I wrote quietly that if my daughter continued to use my name to make a future for herself without my consent, I would file a police report. My hand shook and I left it shaking. Strength that requires stillness is not strength, it is theater. I spent the afternoon patching the screen door with a kit from a hardware store that has known me through weather and grief. Patching is its own liturgy measure, cut anchor smooth. You look for the place the small invaders got in and you make the hole smaller, then gone. I know this is a metaphor and I am not sorry. The screen held. The clouds turned the color of spoons. I ate soup from the pot. I slept like a tree proud of its own trunk. On Wednesday, I drove back with an extraordinary calm I did not trust. The restaurant was the kind with soft lighting that makes even arguments look cinematic. He stood to shake my hand, her fiancé, with the grip of a man taught to perform manners. He called me Margaret as if we were colleagues, and I thought how few people have earned the right to call me Mom. My daughter was already talking before we took our seats, filling the air with sweet noise to keep it from hearing us. The server set down water as if staging props. When the first round of pleasantries loosened, he leaned forward. "We're just trying to plan for a beautiful day," he said, "and it's common for family to invest." "I'm investing in a beautiful life," I said, "and I've learned that begins with not spending what I don't owe." My daughter squeezed his hand under the table. It looked like a signal to both of them that they were in this together. I remembered my first year married, how I'd rallied behind nonsense, because I thought marriage meant choosing a side even when the ground beneath it was mud. He spoke then, in that confident voice men are awarded at birth. "I make good money," he said, "but cash flow is complicated right now." The word cash flow came out slick as a sales brochure. "Once things even out, we'll make it right. I'm sure your future will be extraordinary," I said, hearing how true and unbothered that sentence could be when it did not include my wallet. "But this is not a loan. It is a boundary." He smiled a professional expression and tried strategy. "You were given a house," he said, "and the cabin. It seems unfair to hold your daughter to a standard of self-sufficiency you never needed." Those were earned over 30 years of early mornings and late nights, and learning to ask less of the world than it asked of me, I said. And even if they had fallen from the sky, they would still be mine. Gifts do not obligate you to disown yourself. His expression flickered the recognition that he was not playing chess so much as trying to negotiate with a door. He pivoted to charm, then to blame, then to nostalgia, picking from a toolkit I recognized because I had once used the same on myself. My daughter's eyes moved between us, like birds looking for a safe ledge. "Mom," she pleaded, "I don't need everything. Just the deposits, we already told people." Oh. I slid the list I had made across the table. Names, numbers, the sentence that had cost me sleep: "If charges continue, I will file a report." I said it calmly, and something in my voice must have sounded new, because my daughter's face changed. Not into fear, into recognition. She saw me, I think, not as a bank or a problem or a relic of grief, but as a woman who might be teaching her a thing nobody else would. He sat back. He would call it respect in the retelling. I will call it recalculation. We ordered dinner like we were people who eat. We used forks like we understood how to hold them. We made a repayment plan that did not feel like generosity so much as math. We agreed to meet the florist together, not because I was paying, but because my daughter's eyes softened when I said I would stand next to her in a room where things grow. When we rose, my daughter hugged me hard enough to hurt, and in that press I recognized her again, the child who once clung at preschool drop-off, as if the space between us were a cliff. At the door, he shook my hand, and there was something awkward in it now, as if he had learned the shape of a boundary, and it did not fit his palm. At home, I set my keys in the bowl and stood in the quiet like a student waiting to see if she'd passed. The house sighed a familiar companionable sound. I poured water, no ice, the way I like it. I did not turn on the television to teach the room a human voice. I did not open my phone to translate silence into scroll. I stood at the sink, lifted the glass, and toasted nobody and everybody. The woman I had been, the woman knitting herself back together. The woman I would be in the next difficult conversation. The toast landed on my tongue like a prayer I could finally say without apologizing for its length. The days after the dinner moved like a tide that had finally decided which way it meant to go. I woke a little earlier as if my body knew there would be visitors at the threshold of my resolve. The first was my son, who arrived mid-morning with that noisy energy men get when they are trying to cover shame with irritation. He knocked like a landlord, 3 short bangs. I opened the door and watched the surprise cross his face when he saw the new deadbolt grinning like a fresh scar. He lifted his hands in a parody of surrender, said he was only here to borrow a tool, said his card had glitched, said, I must have clicked something wrong. I asked him to step inside, and for the first time in years, I did not step aside. It is a small difference physically, a couple of inches of doorway, but it is the exact distance between an old life and a new one. He deflated in the way boys do when their mother does not let them choose the weather in her house. We sat at the table, and I told him what I knew and what I had done and what would no longer be happening. He talked about pride and how it would humiliate him to tell his friends he'd had a card declined. I let him sit in the sting of that and did not offer a salve. Then his face softened into something like the boy who once brought me a fistful of dandelions and called it a bouquet, and he admitted what I had suspected: there had been more than the charges I'd seen. He had floated cash to his sister and her fiancé, and they had promised to square it when the gifts started arriving. The words landed like a box of ornaments, shifted too quickly. You hear the clink of breakage, and you don't open the lid yet, because you are not ready to see which memories you have lost. I asked him why he hadn't come to me. He said I would have said no. I said that is not a reason to steal. He went red like a boy who has reached for the jar on the top shelf and found it full of air. The old me would have wrapped that redness in a blanket and called it love. The new me let it cool into a color he might remember. I told him we would be untangling this with the bank. I told him there would be a repayment plan. I told him a deputy would be present when he returned the keys he had lent to friends for quick stops. He laughed, and then saw I was not laughing, and stopped as if someone had pressed a fingertip to his throat. He handed the keys over slowly like a surrender flag tied too tightly to a stick. When he left, the house regained a quiet that felt different from loneliness. It felt like a pause in music where the audience understands this is not the end, but the breath required to reach it. The bank met me like a hospital meets someone who has finally admitted pain. In a small room with chairs built to punish bad posture, I sat with a fraud specialist who wore the weary kindness of a person who has seen too many people apologize for being betrayed. We went through statements, authorizations, merchant notes, and the cool, indifferent ledger of time-stamped approvals. It turns out that when love borrows your name, it leaves footprints. There were IP addresses I did not recognize, and a sudden change to my address of record that had nearly redirected my statements to a temporary suite in an office building near my daughter's fiancé's gym. It had been reversed when my email pinged the request back for confirmation, which I had refused without understanding. I was saving myself from becoming a ghost in my own accounts. The specialist took notes and said the phrase, "We'll open a case," and for the first time, case did not mean a glass box of evidence but a container for my fear that would be carried by someone else for a while. She asked if I had considered filing a police report. I told her I had considered it so deeply the consideration itself had kept me awake. She nodded in a way that made me feel both ordinary and brave. The attorney was efficient in the way a good winter coat is efficient. It keeps you warm without making you think about weather all day. We reviewed my will. We clarified who gets what and when and how, and for the first time in months I felt the future as a line I was drawing rather than a fog I was wandering into. We added language I did not know existed, the kind that protects people from their most persuasive relatives. There is a dignity in paperwork when it is the paper that allows you to work. When he slid the final page toward me and I signed, I felt the small shock of seeing my name become a tool I wielded for myself. He said there would be pushback. He said families often confuse generosity with obligation. He said a sentence that has become the hinge of this entire season of my life: You cannot teach adults what childhood denied them without enduring their tantrums. I drove home repeating that to the rhythm of my turn signal. My daughter texted me wedding-related questions that pretended not to be requests. Could I store boxes for just a week because their place is small? Could I check my junk folder for vendor confirmations because her email sometimes does that? Could I mail a check because one vendor only takes them and her bank placed a hold? The words only and just are the thieves of peace. I answered with love and plainness. Yes, you can store boxes on my porch. No, I will not be a mailbox for people who do not know where I live. No, I will not be sending checks. The discipline of saying no with warmth feels like learning an instrument late in life. Your fingers move awkwardly at first, and then one day, you hear a note that sounds almost like music. I expected the next chapter to be a cold war of texts and silences, but betrayal rarely keeps to neat forms. It arrived as a voicemail from the county clerk's office, a woman with a voice like a bell saying they had received a notice of interest filed against my cabin property. The words didn't make sense together like a sentence made of beautiful nouns that do not belong in the same stanza. When I called back, she explained a party had filed a claim stating they had an equitable interest in the cabin because of funds commingled for shared events, and the phrase, prospective marital assets, sat on my tongue like a shard. She read the name, and it was my daughter's fiancé. There are moments in a life when the body takes over because the mind is too polite to furnish the correct response. I did not weep or shout. I felt a steady heat rise to my face, and I sat down like a person going off a swing for the first time in 30 years. I thanked the clerk and hung up and dialed my attorney, and then because I'm a widow familiar with bridges, I called the sheriff's office to ask very calmly what paperwork I would need to have on hand when I visited the cabin next. I drove to the lake at noon, a time when the water looks like a blank page you have not ruined yet. The world was mean with heat. On the porch, a man I did not know sat on my steps, with a look that said he had the right to wait where he pleased. He stood and extended a hand and announced himself as a friend of my son's there to check the locks. It is one thing to be disrespected by your own children. It is another to find the disrespect franchised. I told him the deputy would be there shortly and that he was to leave the property until then. He smiled in that way people smile when they are reevaluating a woman's potential for making trouble, and he took a photograph of the door. I stepped inside, locked it behind me, and phoned the deputy again, the voice of a man who sounded as though he'd seen worse and better, and knew I would prefer better. When the deputy arrived, he stood with his hands on his belt the way men do when they are choosing which part of their training will be required. He took notes, looked at the filing with the county, and made that soft hum people make when admiration slips out before they can hide it. This is clever, he said, not approvingly, but academically. Clever isn't lawful. He spoke to the man on the porch and sent him away. He watched while I changed the locks with the kit I had learned to use the week before, my hands steady as if a teacher were grading me. He advised me to post a notice not for trespassers, but for myself, a piece of paper to remind me I was the one in charge of reminding everyone else. When he left, he tipped his hat in the old way that makes you ache for decency. Some people embody a town. He was one of them. I called my daughter. She said she hadn't known about the filing, that she would handle it, that I didn't need to make it a thing. The thing about a thing is that it does not ask permission to be itself. I told her the paper had my name. That made it my thing. She cried and then got angry and then went flat, a dangerous landscape where all emotion is paved with certainty. She said her fiancé was trying to secure their future, and I told her he had made an enemy of the past by stealing from it. I asked her if she understood that every time a man uses a legal trick to take something from a woman, he is writing her into a bad story. She said, "He's not like that," and I said, "He has become like that with you." The attorney filed the counter, a form with more teeth than I knew paper could grow. He included exhibits that felt like a strange museum of my recent life: bank statements, email screenshots, the deed with my husband's ink singing my name. He advised me not to speak to the fiancé, and so I did the cruelest thing a mother can do, and let silence teach where my voice had often substituted for it. Word came back that the claim was withdrawn without prejudice, the kind of phrase that sounds gracious and is actually evasive. He had tried the door and found it locked. They always call that unfair. I wish I could tell you this cured anything. Families are not fevers that break with one good sweat. What changed was less dramatic and more enduring. My daughter began to text me about things that had nothing to do with money. A picture of a dress that was not her wedding dress because she had decided to keep that for herself. A recipe for roasted carrots that called for cumin and honey and made our thumbs smell like a shared kitchen. A photograph of the sky on a drive where she'd finally learned to love the landscape she grew up promising to escape. We were building a small bridge, plank by plank, laid without ceremony, and strong enough for two people walking carefully toward each other. At night, I took the letters my husband had written and read them not as biography, but as instruction. He had loved me in a way that would have been impossible if he had asked me to be a resource rather than a partner. Sometimes memories can be tutors if you sit in the front row and stop passing notes to your own nostalgia. I fell asleep with my hand over the place on my chest where I imagined grief lived, and I woke with my hand still there, and the odd certainty that grief had moved lower, closer to my feet, where it might anchor me instead of toppling me. There was one more call I had to make, and I made it with the kind of generosity that looks like cruelty to the untrained eye. I phoned my son and told him I loved him, and that he would not be in possession of a key to my house for a while. I told him what I had learned about myself and about him, and that when he had learned it too, he could ask to be trusted again. I told him a deputy's name and number and said that if a stranger ever sat on my porch again in his name, I would involve that man not as punctuation, but as grammar. He was quiet in the way men are when the world has surprised them by not being a mother they can persuade. He said he understood. He did not yet, but the distance between his mouth and his mind felt smaller than it had been. That is sometimes all you get. Back at the cabin, I walked down to the dock at dusk and let the boards speak their old Creek language under my weight. The lake performed its daily miracle, taking the light into itself with no complaint, making a story out of another day's end without naming it tragedy. In the reeds, a heron stood like a possibility. I thought about revenge, how people expect it to be loud and public and fueled by gasoline. Mine had been private, administrative, a series of signatures and locks and sentences spoken in rooms with cheap chairs. But the effect was the same as any cinematic explosion. A structure that could not survive its own dishonesty had fallen, and the open air where it once stood had become a place I could breathe. I am not naive. There will be arguments in brighter rooms. There will be relatives who see me at the grocery store and choose a different aisle. There will be days when I wish I could still buy the illusion that paying for something means owning it. But there is also this: the evening, the water, the way my name sounds when it belongs to me. The week unspooled in small, deliberate chores that felt like braiding rope. I cooked from what I had. I took the long way home from work and let the town show me the backs of buildings I had never bothered to admire. I said yes to a neighbor's invitation to sit on her stoop and pass a plate of sliced peaches back and forth until our fingers were sticky with a sweetness no one could invoice. I was learning how to live without the background hum of panic. It made me clumsy at first, like a person stepping off a moving walkway and forgetting the ground has a speed of its own. But then there were moments when I forgot to remember to be brave, and it felt like the way you finally stop gripping the armrest during turbulence, because the plane keeps flying whether you white-knuckle it or not. On Friday, my daughter texted a photograph of a bouquet sample, nervy mauves and apricots, the sort of palette that announces itself with confidence and a single line. "Will you come meet the florist with me tomorrow?" I stared at the screen until the words rearranged into a sentence I could hold without flinching. She had not asked me to pay. She had asked me to stand next to her while something living was chosen for a day we had not agreed on together. I typed yes and felt a quiet click in my chest, the sound of a door I had not expected to unlock. That night, I slept with the windows open and dreamed not of bills or filings or locks, but of a path through a stand of birch trees, pale trunks like ribs letting the light pass through. The florist worked out of a sunlit studio that used to be a tailor's shop, the kind of place where scissors once sang through cloth, and the owner knew your shoulders by heart. My daughter was already there, cheeks flushed, hair pulled back with the casual elegance that makes strangers assume her life is easier than it is. The florist, a woman about my age with a pen tucked behind her ear and soil crescents under her nails, looked up at me with the frank appraisal of a person who has no interest in selling to the wrong soul. "We'll begin with what matters," she said, sliding a legal pad across the counter. "What cannot be compromised?" My daughter started to speak and then looked at me, and the look said more than any palate could. I shrugged. "That the flowers smell like themselves," I said, "not like a store." The florist smiled in a way that made me think we might have been friends in another life. My daughter nodded and scribbled. "Lavender. Peonies only if they're in season. No dyed anything." I watched her write it down like a vow to reality. We moved through buckets of possibility, and for a while we were just two people naming beauty without trying to own it. Then the bell above the door jingled that old-fashioned sound that makes you think of deliveries and news, and my daughter's fiancé stepped in with his parents. His mother wore a cream jacket you could use as a ruler, everything in straight lines. His father held a folder fat with printouts. They were all smiles, the rehearsed kind, like parade waves, until they saw me, and then the smiles became something tighter, a stitch pulled. My daughter stiffened, not into the brittle posture of a person bracing for impact, but into the surprised line of someone who has been cast in the wrong scene. "We thought we'd help," his mother said, setting her bag on the counter, as if counters were a stage designed for the placement of her possessions. The florist raised an eyebrow, the universal punctuation for "not in my shop." My daughter looked at me and I looked back, and in that glance we decided to let the room learn us. "We're keeping it simple," my daughter said, and the fiancé's father chuckled the way men do when they are about to complicate things with PowerPoint. He slid the folder open to a printed spreadsheet, columns of numbers that took up space the way weeds do when you neglect a yard. "We've already placed the deposits," he said, tapping his pen against the page, as if the tapping made the numbers moral. "It's really a matter of reallocating." Given the constraints, he nodded toward me with a calm rudeness so practiced it barely made sound. "We'll need to shift money from decor into florals." Still aiming for the garden romance look. He said the phrase garden romance like a dietitian pronouncing a dessert acceptable. My daughter's face did something. Then I will never forget the look people get when they realize the voice they have been hearing as their own is actually someone else's ventriloquism. "We haven't placed deposits here," she said. Her fiancé's mouth moved faster than his eyes. "We held a rate," he said. "It's how it works." The florist took the pen from behind her ear and put it on the counter with a click. "That is not how it works," she said. "I meet the bride. I meet her mother if the bride brings her. Then we decide how it will smell." It should have been funny. It felt like oxygen. He tried to charm the florist. She let the charm fall to the floor, uninterested in picking it up. His mother adjusted her cuffs. "Well," she said, "since we're all here, perhaps we can finalize. We have a rehearsal dinner to plan, and we'd like to get head counts to the caterer by Monday." She turned to my daughter like a museum docent describing a painting. "Darling, it's so much easier when the women are aligned." That last word, aligned, arrived on my skin like a cold coin. My daughter looked at me again. I thought of all the rooms I had been in where women were asked to align with things that did not love them. I opened my bag and took out the packet my attorney had assembled after the filing was withdrawn. It wasn't ammunition, it was weather. You bring a coat not to attack the cold but to withstand it. I laid the top page down. It bore the county seal and the line, "Notice of Withdrawal." Under it, the name of the fiancé, elegant as a snake. His father's pen stilled. His mother's mouth made a small, perfect O. The fiancé reached for the page, and I touched it first lightly. A reminder that touch is not a birthright, but a permission. "There will be no further attempts to make my property yours," I said. Not loud, not soft, just the volume of a person stating her address to a paramedic. There will be no further charges using my accounts, my name, my kindness, or the expectation that I am willing to disappear. The florist will be paid by the person whose day this is. If my daughter asks me for a gift, I will give it if it fits in my hand. People think climaxes are fireworks. Sometimes they are a room where everyone realizes the script has changed and the new one will not be provided. His father recovered first because men trained to carry briefcases are also trained to rearrange themselves mid-stride. There's been a misunderstanding, he said words that have rescued more scoundrels than any law. We never intended to. I let him trail off the sentence, tightening itself into a leash. You intended, I said calmly. You filed. You withdrew. That is the order. The florist. God bless her, slid a small vase toward my daughter. Hold these, she said. Decide if they belong near your throat. My daughter lifted the ranunculus and angled them against her neck, as if auditioning a future that did not require a ledger. She looked younger and older at once, the way people look when the costume comes off and you realize the skin underneath is a uniform too, but one they chose. His mother tried a different angle, nostalgia. I remember my own wedding, she said, smoothing the sentence as if it were a sheet she had been folding her whole life. My mother made sacrifices, so did mine, I said, and I felt my own mother's grocery store hands ghost into the air between us. The way she used to stack cans like they were building blocks for a house she would never be allowed to live in. But none of those sacrifices were requisitions. The fiancé touched the county document again lightly now, the way a person touches a valuable thing that does not belong to them. I wanted to secure us, he said, and for the first time there was not triumph in his voice, but something like embarrassment. He had been taught to admire cleverness. He was unlearning it in real time. My daughter set the flowers down. She did not cry. She did not fuss with her hair or apologize for the air in the room. She took a breath like a diver and let it out like a person who has decided to climb the ladder instead. We will be paying for what we choose, she said. We will be choosing less. She glanced at me and I felt the smallest tremor of pride walk my spine like a careful cat. And we will not be using anyone's property but our own. Her voice did not shake. Her fiancé nodded emotion that looked like a man practicing an unfamiliar language. His mother's eyes glittered with the ache of a person who had wanted to preside over a pageant. His father closed the folder with a click and put his hand on his son's shoulder, a silent sentence, "You've learned that this woman will not be managed." The florist wrote a number on the pad and slid it to my daughter. It was modest and beautiful in its restraint. After they left his parents to a car that looked like money trying to pass for modesty, the fiancé to a corner where he made a call that sounded like an apology rehearsed for a bank, my daughter and I sat on the studio's low bench. Dust motes did their old-century dance in the light. I didn't know about the filing, she said quietly, and I believed her in the way you believe a person who has just learned the difference between ignorance and innocence. I know, I said, and we let the silence be a place rather than a weapon. I have something of Dad's for you, I added, surprised by my own sentence as it left me. At home that evening I opened the chest again, not for the cabin papers this time, but for an envelope I had touched and put back a dozen times since he died, in his slanted script for her when she is more woman than girl. I had always stopped at the seal, afraid of choosing the wrong time, as if time were a math problem with one answer. But watching my daughter hold her own voice in a florist shop felt like watching a light find its wiring. I handed her the envelope across my kitchen table. She read it standing up as if sitting would be a kind of surrender. His words were simple, the way his best words always were. He wrote about choosing a life that felt like breathing rather than posing. He wrote that love is a habit, not an event. He wrote that money behaves like a rumor, you can spread it without proof, and by the time you check, the damage has been done. He enclosed a small certificate I had almost forgotten existed, a savings bond he had purchased when she was 12, set to mature the year she turned 26. It wouldn't fund a wedding. It would buy a few months of rent in a city that felt like a second chance. She pressed the paper to her chest and laughed, that laugh grief had kept from me for too long. He wrote this, she said, as if he knew. He knew I said, and the sentence didn't break either of us. We made tea, we sat, we talked about colors and vows and what kind of marriage grows in shade and what kind burns in candles. We did not decide anything except that deciding would be hers to do. At the door, she hugged me with her whole body, not just arms, and whispered thank you into the space over my heart. I thought of the infant she had been pressed to me like a question. I thought of the toddler who had fallen asleep on my lap during thunderstorms, certain I could barter with the sky. I thought of the young woman turning the envelope over and over as if the paper itself might give off heat. Later at the lake, I took a chair down to the end of the dock and sat with my ankles drifting in the cool. The stars were ordinary and therefore miraculous. Across the water, someone's radio played a song from a summer when my life had not required this kind of ferocity, and the memory did not undo me. I thought I wanted revenge and discovered I wanted repair. I thought I wanted vindication and discovered I wanted a vocabulary for the kind of love that refuses to be extorted. I thought I was finished mothering and discovered the job is not to keep them from falling, but to keep yourself from cushioning the ground every time. The wind came up gentle and wrote its name along my forearms. When I finally locked the cabin door and climbed into bed, I did not rehearse speeches for the next battle. I said out loud to the dark and to the man who had taught me the usefulness of ugly cardigans and percolators and the pleasure of cheap red wine that I was learning how to be a person again. I said I would be clumsy. I said I would get better. I said I would not trade myself for a seat at any table where the bill masqueraded as love. The house settled with a sound like agreement. I slept until the gulls started their gossip. In the morning, my phone lit up with a message from my son. No requests, no explanations. A photograph of a stack of applications he'd filled out for a part-time job he could have considered beneath him last month. Under it, 3 words: I'm trying, Mom. I believed him exactly as far as he had earned, which is to say, enough to make breakfast. I fried an egg, opened the windows, and let the lake rewrite the air. A week later, a cream-stalked card arrived, addressed in my daughter's careful hand, the kind of handwriting you adopt when you want the world to believe you were born composed. Inside was an invitation not to the rehearsal dinner, but to a family conversation at their apartment on Sunday evening. No caterer, no printed menu, no clink of glassware to make declarations feel prettier than they are. I set the card on the counter, poured myself water the way I like it, no ice, and listened to the house agree that words spoken in plain rooms tend to tell the truth more efficiently. I took down the old spiral notebook and flipped past the pages where my pen had already saved me bank numbers, phrases to anchor me, consequences drawn like small fences. On a clean page, I wrote 2 sentences: I will not be managed. I will not manage you. It felt like a vow a person might make to herself before stepping into a chapel with no pews. Sunday afternoon, I drove to the lake first because I wanted to carry the porch's steady air into the evening. The screens held. The geese discussed their itineraries as if they needed my permission to depart. In the drawer where the bottle opener lives, I kept a single sheet the attorney had given me after the florist incident. Not a weapon, so much as a mirror. A sample prenuptial agreement with the space for names left blank. It was not a dare. It was a way of naming the boundary aloud in a dialect the world respects. I had no intention of presenting it like a surprise on a game show. I brought it for the weight of its language, the way certain words are scaffolding even if they never touch anything. Their apartment was tidy in the way of places that haven't had time to collect the comfortable ugliness of real life. My daughter opened the door in a sweater too large for spring sleeves pushed to her elbows, like a junior architect about to sign off on a smaller bridge. The fiancé stood behind her, hands in his pockets, the stance of a man who had practiced patience in the mirror and liked how it looked. On the coffee table, tea, not wine, a plate of cookies with the restrained neatness of a store that wants you to believe someone's grandmother works there. His parents were not present. Already the room felt lighter. He began with an apology, the modern kind words all in the right order, like a well-laid table. I counted the pronouns, the way a nurse counts the beats of a heart. I'm sorry I tried to solve a problem without including you. I'm sorry I treated your history like a resource. I'm sorry I made security into a competition. I listened for the important part the sentence where the apology stops being a rake smoothing footprints and becomes a seed. And then it arrived, I am making this right without asking you to pay for it. And I am embarrassed that took me so long. My daughter looked at him, and looked at me, and then down at her own hands, as if amazed she could hold any of this without dropping it. It is its own kind of grace when a man chooses to be taught. She turned to me. I want a different kind of wedding, she said, and the phrase different kind felt like a door swinging open onto a smaller, better room. I want witnesses, not audiences. I want to smell the flowers without totaling them. She took a breath. I want an agreement between us that protects what isn't ours to spend. She glanced at the paper peeking from my bag and half smiled. I want words that reflect what we're saying now. He nodded. A prenup, he said, and his voice didn't do the defensive little dance men's voices sometimes do when asked to honor a border. Fair terms, clear names. He made eye contact with me the way you look at a person who could be your fiercest advocate or your kindest opponent depending on how you behave. Your property is your property. Your accounts are your accounts. Your name stays yours in every ledger. He swallowed. And I'll be paying back your son. He didn't wear the sentence like a medal, and for that alone I felt the air adjust a degree toward bearable. We sat with tea cooling faster than we drank it. We said the practical things that signal a real change. A call booked with an attorney neither blood nor romance chose. A budget revised where numbers stopped pretending to be feelings. A guest list trimmed until it resembled a table where you could hear each other chew without shame. Then my daughter surprised me with a smaller, more personal request. Could we, she asked, do the vows at the cabin? Not a performance, just us. Later when we're ready. Maybe in fall when the lake smells like wood. She looked as if she might take the words back if I flinched. I didn't. The cabin had been the place where false claims came to die. Perhaps it could also be where truthful ones were born. In the weeks that followed, life behaved like it sometimes knows how to be kind. My son texted photos of his first pay stubs from the part-time job. The numbers were not impressive, which is precisely why I trusted them. He came by to mow my lawn without asking for the gas money I had already set aside. We spoke about interest rates as if we were describing weather, useful, boring, unconcerned with our feelings. He gave me back the spare key he had once treated like a hall pass and said, "Can I earn it again?" I told him keys are easier to return than trust, and trust does better on a schedule than on a promise. He nodded. Living, I have learned, is mostly nodding at the right lessons in time to put them to use. The bank sent me a letter with the case number and the word resolved printed where my dread had once slept. I put it in the drawer with the rubber bands and the tea and let it sit among the ordinary things, a trophy no one has to dust. I took the spiral notebook out only to write things that made the page smell like my life. A neighbor's zucchini placed on my porch as if vegetables were a currency better than money. A note from the florist. A single sprig of dried lavender tucked in with an invoice that nearly apologized for being so low. The first lines of a recipe for roasted carrots, cumin and honey, the flavor of a kitchen where nobody is keeping score. Then one evening, my daughter came over alone with a paper bag hooked over her forearm. She set it on the counter and pulled out a pair of shoes, the kind that looked like poetry, made out of leather, low-heel, almond toe, a bow as unself-conscious as a child's ponytail. "Walk with me," she said, and we did up and down my hallway like we were measuring a life for alterations. He signed, she told me, as if it were simply a weather report. We both did. She folded the tissue paper back into the bag, as if practicing for the carefulness we were all learning. We moved the date, she added. We're not ready to make something forever in a hurry. We went to the cabin the following weekend with a cooler that made the back seat smell like dill and a pile of mismatched quilts, because comfort cannot tell the difference between stylish and sincere. We did not make a wedding out of it. We made something quieter lunch on the porch, with our feet braced against the rail. A bouquet from what the florist called the awkward bin. the stems too short for centerpieces, but perfect for a table that has room for elbows. A reading of his letter again. Only this time, my daughter's voice vibrated on the line about love being habit, not event, as if the idea had found a closet in her chest and started unpacking. She placed a small jar on the windowsill with a label she'd written in black marker for repairs. Not a fund for flowers or favors. A jar, for when a screen tears, for when a hinge sticks, for when a family recognizes that maintenance, not miracle, is what keeps houses upright. Toward evening, my son texted from the driveway, brought desserts. Not the expensive kind, the good kind. He carried in a paper bakery box tied with string the color of old books. He asked if he could bring a friend to help fix the dock next weekend, not the one who'd sat on the porch like a claim jumper, but the quiet one who'd apologized to me at the hardware store without telling me why. We ate cakes that tasted like a summer where nobody borrowed from tomorrow. We talked about nothing in a way that taught us everything: how to interrupt each other less, how to disagree and still pass the plate, how to say I was wrong in a voice that doesn't attempt to make the admission look noble. When at last the wedding came, it was not fall at the lake. It was a small afternoon in a garden behind the courthouse where the city plants rosemary because someone in Parks and Rec understands memory needs a scent. 6 people stood under a maple that had outlived more administrations than anyone could name. The officiant was tired in the way of people who do work that matters for long enough to make it matter more. Vows were spoken in tones built for kitchens, not stages. Rings were simple. The photographer was a friend of a friend who bartered half her fee for a week of cat-sitting, and the pictures looked like truth because nobody tried to coerce the light. His parents came late and left early, and managed miraculously to do both graciously. My son wore the suit he had once rented, but paid for himself this time, and he pulled a crumpled index card from his pocket to read the only toast of the day: may you never treat each other like a convenience store. May you always keep enough cash on hand to buy flowers that smell like themselves. May you learn to fix the thing before you throw it away. After my daughter and I sat together on the curb for a moment in our good shoes, eating the kind of grocery store strawberries that stain your fingers if you don't pretend they're classier than they are, she leaned her head on my shoulder. I keep thinking Dad would hate that he missed this, she said. And she was right, and we let that be true without turning it into a tragedy. He didn't, I said, not from the superstition of the bereaved, but from the certainty of a woman who has set her own table and recognized every chair. He saved you a seat, and you chose it. Weeks later, alone at the cabin, I took the notebook down and filled the last pages with fewer lists and more sentences that sounded like a person who intends to live. I wrote that boundaries are how love stays love and not labor. I wrote that repair is louder than revenge if you put your ear to the wood. I wrote that I used to fear being alone, and now I fear only becoming smaller than the room I am in. I wrote that my children are adults I am learning to meet at eye level, where the view includes their mistakes and mine, and the marvelous fact that we can still recognize each other from here. If you're listening because you have been made into a purse or a plan or a placeholder, I hope you hear the one thing I learned too late and will practice every day until it becomes my accent. Kindness is not a receipt. You do not have to prove what you gave. You do not have to overpay to stay. The people who love you will learn the currency of you, or they will spend themselves elsewhere and you will remain solvent inside your own life. If any part of this found you in your kitchen with a bill that isn't yours, or in a quiet room with a bruise no one else can see, or at a lake with a lock in your hand you're afraid to change, consider this your permission and your companion. You are allowed to rearrange the furniture. You are allowed to call the bank. You are allowed to be a mother who chooses a lesson over a performance. The story you tell about yourself does not have to match the one they are trying to sell in your name. Thank you for sitting with me through this. If this story helped you breathe a little deeper or reminded you you're allowed to choose yourself, please like the video so it finds someone who needs it tonight. Share it with the friend who always pays and subscribes so we can keep each other brave. Tell me in the comments what boundary you're learning to love. I read them when the house is quiet and your words keep my lights on.